Okay, there's been some debate, discussion, confusion about these headings which I've kind of provided for you in order to help you do the critical review, getting the right bits in the right spaces. So there's been some discussion about this. And what I really want to try to do in this screencast, or this video, is to try and just explain a little bit more about what should be in each section and what shouldn't be in each section as well. So the first and perhaps most important part of this, really, in many respects, is getting the aims right. What is the purpose of the study? Now, if you remember back in the in an earlier seminar, and there's a video on this too, I came up with this idea of different kinds of research enterprises. Some of them are trying to actually establish a thing, and some research is trying to not establish a thing, but it's trying to come up with some kind of explanation for a particular kind of thing. So there's broadly two different kinds of research programs that exist. And this is kind of where you put that. So I expect somewhere in here that just the purpose of this research, or the aims of research, was that in order to show that such and such exists, or whether it was trying to say, to explain altruism, or to explain selfishness, or explain why men prefer women with narrow hip to waist ratios, or whatever. So that's kind of what you're trying to do. You're trying to, in very punchy language, try and say what the purpose of the study was about to begin with, so we know what it's about. Now, the reason why I said this is possibly the most important bit, it's certainly not the most important bit in terms of marks, right? You're going to get some marks for doing this right, but it's not going to be like 90% for getting that right and 10% for getting all the rest of it right. And what I mean by most important, really, is there's a Latin phrase, sine qua non. Sine qua non. And basically it means something like without which nothing. Or in more obvious, less technical language, if you don't have this bit, you're not really going to get anything else. And what I mean by that is that if you don't properly understand the aims of the study, what the study was trying to do, then all of this other stuff is going to be difficult to do, particularly the bit at the bottom, the critique. You need to know what the study is trying to do in order to know how to critique it. It's a bit like if you're reviewing a product, right? You need to know what the product's trying to do. Right? Is it a mobile phone, or is it a blender, or is it a hand sanitizer, or is it a foot spa? Okay? So you know, if you find it's a foot spa, that the aim is to kind of do whatever foot spas do, you know, kind of make your feet feel nice and whatever. If it's a hand sanitizer, it's to sanitize your hands. If it's a mobile phone, it's a form of communication, as a communication system. Without knowing what a thing is supposed to be, you're not really going to be able to properly criticize it. So if you don't know that a mobile phone's a mobile phone, and you start to criticize it inappropriately and say, well, I know I've been trying this mobile phone for 6 months and it hasn't once sanitized my hand, or it's not really doing my feet any good at all, or you're trying to ring somebody up or upload a picture on Instagram using a foot spa, you're kind of barking up the wrong tree. So that's why this is important. If you don't get this bit right, it's going to be very hard to know whether the researchers have got it right. Have they achieved their own objectives? If you don't know what the objectives are, you're not going to know whether they've achieved them. So that's very important to get that bit right, and that takes quite a bit of effort, and it's not always easy, as we saw in the seminars that we did on when we reviewed critically reviewed the papers on the Robin Dunbar dancing paper and the Daniel Nettle paper, which about the eyes and honesty. Trying to work out what they're trying to do is tricky, but try it. The background is caused, again, a bit of trouble here. This is largely the background which leads up to the study. What is the theory, the evolutionary theory, what is the past research, which has led them to kind of ask this question, which is in the aims. So quite often in papers, there may be a long introduction, but quite often they will be if it's a fairly short paper, the introduction might be quite brief, and it might not mention stuff in there in much detail, which is critically important to actually understanding the paper itself. So for example, a paper on mate choice, looking at sex differences in mate choice, may fleetingly mention Trivers' parental investment theory, or it may not mention it at all, because it assumes that everybody who's reading this article, and these articles are generally written for professionals, know what the background is, know what Trivers' parental investment theory is all about. But what I want you to do and there are two reasons for doing this, is to try and elaborate this background. So if they fleetingly mention Trivers' parental investment theory, or if they don't mention it at all, but it's relevant, because most of the stuff on sex differences in mate choice characteristics, which is what many of you are doing, is going to be using that theory. I want you to tell them what that theory is, explain what that theory is. You know, the higher invest in sex is the sex that is the choosier sex, that kind of stuff. But explain how it pans out, what the relevance of it is to the study, all that kind of stuff. So fleshing it out, if they fleetingly describe or mention the selfish gene theory, the gene-centered view of life, which again most will be in the background of most of them, then maybe you need to flesh that out. People have asked me whether they should put research in there which isn't in the paper in here. My tendency would be to say generally don't. You should really be describing the theories and research that they're drawing on. But as I say, if they don't mention Trivers' parental investment theory, say, in there, you might need to mention that and put a reference to it. So it's difficult to say. Generally don't put new stuff in there, but you may need to put a couple of references, some of the more basic stuff which is underpinning the things in here. Some people have asked me about voice and the tone in which you're writing, and I think with this bit it's very important, with all these bits here down to the evaluation, it's very important that you make it clear that you are describing what they did. And it's important to separate out what they think about something from what you think about something, and from what you think about what they think about something, if that's not too complicated. So here we want language like the authors draw upon parental investment theory. Maybe then you say parental investment theory is where blah blah blah. The authors cite numerous bits of research which have showed this. The authors did this. That kind of language. When we get to the evaluation, this is where you're in there. So then it's your view. So this is where you're questioning. And trying to separate those two voices out is very important, a very tricky thing to do. But it's important to know when you're reading a review like this, or whether you're reading an essay, or whether you're reading marking a project, third year project, whether what is being said is your view or the view of somebody else. So that's the kind of voice we want here. Method, again, pretty obvious. Oh, but by the way, towards the end of here, I want some mention of what they're expecting to find, what are they predicting, what are their research questions. So the background should then say, so what they tried to do was to see whether, men preferred women with greater or smaller hip to waist ratios, or whatever it happened to be. Method is self-explanatory in what they did. Try and keep this relatively brief, but try and make it comprehensible so I know exactly what they did. Did participants fill in questionnaires? Did participants have to look at something? What did they look at? That kind of stuff. What were the conditions? What were the variables? Results is pretty much what they found. In terms of statistical details, people say, should I put the details in there? Should I report all their ANOVAs? Should I tell them what kind of analysis they did? I think generally it's okay to say that they found a significant difference between, or a significant relationship between, or they found that such and such predicted something, without going into all the details, without even perhaps mentioning necessarily that it was a 5-way ANOVA or an ANCOVA or whatever. If it's more technical, maybe you might want to mention that, but certainly I wouldn't bother mentioning things like the p-values and the t-values and the effect sizes, unless you think there's a problem. So if, like that Kanazawa paper, where he tried to pass off a significance level of p less than 0.1 as being significant, you probably wouldn't draw attention to the details. So if you had small effect sizes, you get an effect size of like d equals 0.1 or something like that. It might be worth mentioning, the effect sizes, although these results were significant, the effect sizes were pretty weak, e.g. an average of d equals 0.1, that kind of stuff. But details are only usually worth mentioning if you think there's something suspicious or you want to draw our attention to something particularly interesting. So what they think they've found, and then what they're concluding. I've managed to rub some of this off with my shirt, so I'm going to get a big black stain on the back of my shirt here, because I've been using my shirt as a blackboard eraser or whiteboard eraser. Their conclusions. This comes back to the aims. So you might want to revisit the aims very briefly. The aims of this study was to do this. They think they've found support for whatever it is, or they think they've established the particular phenomenon they want to establish. The evaluation is the bit where you really go to town here. So the evaluation is the bit where you really show that you understand the paper, that you show you're able to criticise the paper, that you're able to evaluate the paper. And it doesn't always have to be negative, although maybe some of it will be negative. And remember, the evaluation can be in terms of evaluating the extent to which the background reasonably relates to the research questions, the method was okay, the results were okay, the conclusions adequately summarise the results, etc., etc. Can involve all of those things, or some of them, you know, it's up to you, what you pick, what you think are the most important bits here. People sometimes say, well, how many shall I put in? It's very difficult to say. Some people manage to spend all their time talking about one important thing that's wrong with it. Sometimes two, sometimes three. Sometimes they focus exclusively on methodology, some of them focus exclusively on theory, some of them focus exclusively on analysis. Most people have a combination of things. It's really a matter of, I tend to say, do more with less. So it's better to have 2 or 3 or 4 criticisms which are properly explained, clearly explained, with the implications fully laid out and why this is a problem, than 6 or 7 ones which only fleetingly oh yeah, there are too many males, there are not enough females. You know, it's important to say, if you're going to come up with a criticism like that, say how that might have led to the results that you found. So the evaluations tend to do more with less if you can, you know, properly explain them. In this one, this is where the voice turns to you. Now, some people don't mind people using the first person, I argue, all that kind of stuff. I don't particularly mind that. I think things are moving on in psychology where we're moving away from this ridiculous third person, it is argued here kind of construction. But generally I would say that not everybody in the department looks as favourably upon first person, kind of pronouns, I, me and all that kind of stuff than I do. Some people are much stricter than that than me. So I would tend, if you can, to try to write in this third person. And usually you don't need to say I argue here, you just need to point it out. There may be a problem with the methodology. Their analyses seem to be incorrect. But there you're making it clear, because you've already been talking in the earlier part, the author. Once you switch to this new style of speaking or writing, we know that it's you and not the authors that are expressing that view. Following the evaluation, your conclusions. So, you know, although this was a reasonable study, there was these methodological flaws, briefly mention what they are, which render the study problematic or whatever. Just a, you know, again, a short section that's saying what you think of the paper, summarising basically the evaluation quite quickly. The final bit has led to a bit of confusion. This is the lessons learned section. Now, the reason why I've included the lessons learned section is because the department had a kind of policy for level 6 modules when there's only one assessment, where they say it must be maximum of 4,000 words. Now, I considered 4,000 words to be quite a lot for all this, okay? And that's a maximum, remember. And I tend to like people writing fairly punctually, fairly economically, so that people can understand what they're saying, rather than people just padding it out with a load of waffle. Don't do that. So to try and keep that down, I thought, well, maybe I could have 800 words or so, which is about something slightly different. And the idea I had was it would have some kind of almost like reflective activity here. So lessons learned is nothing about the paper itself per se, it's about the things you learned, the problems you ran into, encountered, how you resolve them, and what you've learned from this process. You know, discussions with me, discussions with other students. So, I learned that it's really important to look at data in tables rather than just taking what the researchers said for granted by looking at by just taking their summary of the statistics. I thought it's really important to attend to effect sizes. It's really important to carefully scrutinise graphs. It's very important to try and read round so you can properly understand the background. Whatever kind of things you've learned. And the hope is that by saying what you've learned from this process, that might help you kind of articulate what you've learned. So when you do this kind of stuff in the future, and believe me, you'll be doing this with your project, you'll be doing this with your dissertation project, with your other assessments. Hopefully, when you say what you've learned, that might help you to do this in the future. I'm hoping that this assessment doesn't just end here. I'm hoping that some of the skills that you might have acquired will help you in the future. This is a difficult process, and you're kind of on the nursery slopes at the moment of critical evaluation, but hopefully this will drag you up there a little bit so that you'll be in a better place to do this in the future. Okay, thanks.